"You're asking my wife to leave?" Samuel's voice cut through the air of the upscale dining room like a sharp blade, silencing the murmurs of the room. As everyone turned to him, his presence alone commanded attention. Today's story unfolds with Alicia Monroe, a brilliant professor, stepping into a lavish birthday dinner at one of the city's most prestigious restaurants, only to be humiliated and denied the seat she had reserved. Minutes later, the arrival of a sleek limited-edition Tesla shatters the illusion of power held by the restaurant, staff, and the guests within. Alicia had been denied simply for the color of her skin, but the truth was about to come crashing in. Alicia's husband, Samuel Monroe, a silent but powerful investor, had quietly built the empire that owned the very restaurant where his wife had been disrespected. As soon as he arrived, the room fell into an uneasy silence. His calm but steady steps toward the staff were a stark contrast to the tension building in the room. Alicia's reservation was reinstated not by apology, but by the unmistakable weight of Samuel's presence. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about dignity, respect, and the unspoken biases that controlled spaces like these. And as the manager, David, fumbled to explain, Alicia stood tall, her calm resolve challenging the Prater's system that had tried to erase her. The silent reckoning was just beginning. The room at Vivre Blanc, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, felt almost surreal. Its gleaming marble floors reflected the soft, ambient light from the enormous chandelier that hung from the ceiling like a frozen firework. Every detail was meticulously curated to give off an air of elegance and exclusivity. A place where the world's elite dined, unseen by most but always watched by those who belonged. Alicia Monroe, a highly respected professor and accomplished academic, had never been one to follow societal norms that demanded conformity. Yet, as she stepped through the polished doors of Vivre Blanc, a mixture of excitement and unease settled in her chest. She knew exactly what she was walking into: a Tuplin room filled with silent judgments based on appearances rather than credentials. Invited to a birthday dinner by a powerful couple, the Langfords, Alicia expected a night of celebration. But instead, she was confronted with an all-too-familiar reality. The hostess, Amber, greeted her with a practiced smile, but the recognition wasn't there. Alicia had made a reservation well in advance, with a specific table reserved by the garden window. When Alicia introduced herself, Amber's polite nod faltered as she flipped through the reservation book, but no entry appeared under her name. Alicia remained calm, reaffirming that her husband, Samuel Monroe, had confirmed the reservation directly with the Langfords. The tension in the room was subtle, but it was palpable. Amber's face tightened with an expression that screamed confusion, yet also something deeper. Despite her polite demeanor, Amber whispered to another staff member before offering Alicia to wait. Time dragged on 5 minutes, then 10, while Alicia observed the arrival of white guests with designer clothes, escorted in without question or hesitation. Each person who entered was treated with grace and deference, their presence not questioned. But Alicia, she was left to stand in the corner, ignored and dismissed, as if she did not belong in the space her reservation had ensured. When Alicia saw another woman, Veronica Langley, walk in dressed in an emerald silk dress with the unmistakable air of confidence, something in her shifted. Veronica was ushered immediately to the same table that had been reserved for Alicia. The hostess, Amber, greeted her warmly and with little hesitation led her to table 3 by the garden window. Alicia, however, wasn't one to stand by silently. She spoke up, her voice soft but firm. "Excuse me, that's the table my husband reserved for me." Amber, caught between protocol and prejudice, smiled thinly and apologized, explaining that Veronica Langley, a regular, had reserved the table. This wasn't just a mix-up, it was something more deliberate, and Alicia felt the sting of it deep in her chest. The restaurant's manager, Gareth Simmons, appeared and confirmed the decision to offer Alicia a seat near the kitchen. A decision that felt like a slap in the face. This was no ordinary misunderstanding. Alicia was a guest in a restaurant that her husband, Samuel Monroe, had helped build, but she was being treated as an outsider, an anomaly, in a world where privilege was not just expected, it was demanded. She knew the game all too well. The delicate social codes, the silent biases. She had seen them all before, in academic boardrooms and faculty meetings, where her achievements were minimized and her presence ignored. But she had never been treated like this before, not in a place she thought she belonged. The anger that simmered in her chest was not just personal, it was systemic. She was a woman, a professor, a scholar, yet in the eyes of the staff at Vivre Blanc, she was an outsider, someone whose reservation could easily be erased because she didn't fit their mold of who belonged in this space. Just as Alicia prepared to respond, as she braced herself to stand her ground, she heard the slant, unmistakable hum of a sleek electric engine outside the restaurant. A Tesla, parked curbside, drawing the attention of every guest in the room. The moment the doors opened and Samuel Monroe stepped out, the entire atmosphere shifted. Samuel, dressed in a perfectly tailored, charcoal gray suit, exuded quiet authority. He wasn't dressed in the overtly flashy manner of the usual elite patrons. Instead, his presence was understated but powerful. He walked with the grace of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone, his movements precise, controlled. The guests in the room looked on in awe, the whispers starting to build. Samuel's gaze immediately locked onto Alicia, who was still standing by the hostess stand, her arms folded, her posture stiff but dignified. "You've been standing here this whole time?" Samuel's voice was low, laced with a tension that rippled through the space. Alicia didn't need to explain. Her expression said everything. She simply nodded towards the hostess stand and stated, "They gave the table to someone else." The room watched in stunned silence as Samuel turned slowly to face the manager, Gareth Simmons. His presence, quiet and unassuming, was enough to cause a shift in the air. "You gave away the table my wife reserved," he stated flatly, his voice measured and calm, but carrying the weight of a question that demanded an answer. Gareth tried to explain, fumbling for words, but it was clear that the power dynamics had shifted. Samuel was no longer just an investor in the restaurant. He was its primary shareholder, holding a majority stake that gave him the power to reshape what was happening in that very moment. As the realization dawned on Gareth and the rest of the staff, the silence in the room became deafening. Samuel continued, unflinching. "You didn't realize this was my wife?" he repeated, almost tasting the absurdity of it. The unspoken judgment that had been cast on Alicia, because she was black, because she wasn't dressed in high-end labels, was now laid bare for everyone to see. Samuel's calm, controlled demeanor had a devastating effect. The truth could no longer be ignored. This wasn't just about a table, it was about the systemic exclusion, the quiet biases, that had governed spaces like Vivre Blanc for far too long. Samuel didn't raise his voice, but the truth echoed through the room, louder than any shout ever could. His calm words were a declaration, not just for Alicia, but for everyone who had ever been quietly excluded, dismissed, or overlooked. In that moment, Alicia was not just reclaiming a seat at a table. She was claiming her rightful place in a system that had long tried to erase her. As they moved towards their reserved table by the garden window, no one stopped them. No one challenged them. The staff, the patrons, and the manager all stood back in silent recognition. Samuel and Alicia's return wasn't just a moment of personal victory, it was a statement to everyone in the room. You can no longer hide behind your biases, and you cannot erase our dignity. The sleek, polished restaurant glistened under the chandeliers, its marble floors reflecting the placid, soft, muted lights, casting an almost surreal ambiance that spoke of wealth and exclusivity. Vivre Blanc, the most coveted restaurant in the city, was a symbol of privilege. Its doors were not open to just anyone. It was the kind of place where a reservation spoke volumes about your status, where a simple dinner became an unspoken performance of social belonging. Alicia Moore, a distinguished professor at Westbridge University, was not a stranger to elite spaces, but this was different. As she stepped through the grand entrance, she was already aware of the unspoken dynamics that permeated rooms like these. She had not grown up in this world, and while she had earned her place in academic and professional circles, something in her chest tightened as she held the exclusive invite from the Langfords, the elite hedge funders who were hosting their daughter's birthday celebration. Despite her reservations, Alicia chose to go, not to conform, not to please, but simply to occupy space, to take up room where she had a right to be. As she approached the hostess stand, the tension that had been building in her chest only grew stronger. Alicia smiled politely at Amber, the hostess, and stated her name. Alicia Moore. I believe I'm on the guest list for the Langford birthday party. Amber, flipping through the leather-bound reservation book with deliberate precision, froze for a moment, her eyes scanning the pages, and then she looked up with an apologetic smile. I'm sorry, but I don't see a reservation under your name, she said. Alicia, though taken aback, remained composed. It should be there. My husband, Samuel Monroe, confirmed it directly with the Langfords. We were invited personally. A flicker of unease crossed Amber's face, but she maintained her poise. The hostess called another staff member over in a hushed tone, and Alicia was asked to wait while they sorted it out. The minutes ticked by slowly, and as the time passed, Alicia noticed something disturbing. Guests began to arrive, most of them white, all dressed in high-end, effortless designer clothing. Each person was welcomed with a polite nod and an escort to their tables. A woman in red Louboutin heels was seated immediately, without so much as a second glance. A man in a linen shirt was escorted to a private lounge with a single polite nod from the staff. Alicia remained standing, unacknowledged, by the hostess stand. Her mind raced, but her expression remained calm. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about being seen, being acknowledged. For the briefest of moments, she wondered if perhaps her presence had been overlooked, simply because of who she was. Then, everything changed. From across the room, a woman entered, confident and poised in a silk emerald dress, exuding the kind of effortless power that made heads turn. She walked straight to the hostess, Amber, who straightened immediately, her smile widening. Miss Langley, welcome. We have your favorite table ready, table 3. Alicia's heart sank. The same table. Her table. Excuse me, she interjected, her voice steady but carrying an edge of disbelief. That's the table my husband reserved for me. Amber blinked but didn't hesitate to respond. I'm sorry, ma'am. There must have been a mix-up. Miss Langley is a regular here, and that table has been reserved for her for weeks. Alicia felt the familiar, bitter taste of being sidelined. This wasn't a mistake. It was something far more deliberate. Her reservation had been overlooked, her presence dismissed. As the hostess led Miss Langley to the garden table, Alicia stood her ground, watching the staff as they busied themselves, ignoring her standing there. At that moment, the restaurant's manager, Gareth Simmons, emerged from the back. His gaze briefly lingered on Alicia before he gave a polite nod and approached the hostess. Is there a problem here? He asked, his tone professional yet somewhat dismissive. Amber explained, and he turned toward Alicia. I'm sorry for the confusion, but we can seat you by the kitchen. It's quieter there, Gareth offered with a forced smile. By the kitchen? Alicia's spine straightened like a blade. Her voice, when it came, was controlled but unwavering. You're offering me the kitchen, while someone else sits at the table reserved in my name? Gareth shrugged nonchalantly. We do our best to accommodate our guests, but sometimes mix-ups happen. Alicia glanced around the room, her fists clenched by her sides. No sign of Samuel yet. No one in her corner. Just the cold indifference of the staff. They had decided she didn't belong here. Her name wasn't important enough to be honored, and just as she opened her mouth to respond, to make it clear that this wasn't just about a table, something changed in the air. The faint purr of an electric engine hummed outside, the kind of sound that commanded attention. Everyone turned toward the door as the sleek doors of a limited edition Tesla opened. In walked Samuel Monroe, the silent investor who had helped build this empire. A man who had kept his presence in the background of the luxury circles he frequented. But when his eyes locked on Alicia, standing by the hostess stand, something in his demeanor shifted. It was subtle but unmistakable. There was a tightening of his jaw, a flash of anger behind his eyes. You've been standing here this whole time? His voice was low, carrying a tension that filled the space. Alicia didn't need to say anything. She just nodded, eyes still locked on. Gareth, they gave my wife's table to someone else, Samuel said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Gareth's face fell, and Alicia's heart pounded as the weight of the moment settled in. Samuel had just made one thing clear. Alicia wasn't just his wife. She was a woman who deserved respect. A woman who didn't need to justify her place in the world. I'm sorry, Mr. Monroe, Gareth stammered. There must have been a misunderstanding, but Samuel wasn't having it. You didn't realize this was my wife? He repeated, tasting the absurdity of the question on his tongue. And tell me, if she hadn't been my wife, would her reservation have magically reappeared? The room froze. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked away, others avoided making eye contact. And in that moment, everything changed. Alicia's reservation was no longer just a seat, it was a declaration. A declaration that she belonged, not because someone decided she did, but because she earned it. Samuel didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to bring down the walls of pretension. As he turned to the manager, his words rang out. This is why I stayed in the background, he said. I wanted to see how people really acted when they didn't know they were being watched. And now you've shown me. When the silence stretched on, Samuel's calm tone carried the truth that no one could ignore. The tables might have been reserved, but dignity could never be taken away so easily. As the tension in Vivre Blanc's dining room continued to hang in the air, Samuel Monroe and Alicia sat at their reserved table by the garden window, the very seat that had been initially denied to her. The restaurant's atmosphere, once smooth and polished like the silverware that adorned the tables, had shifted. The guests were no longer sipping their wine with careless abandon. Instead, they leaned in with curiosity, watching every move. The murmurs had quieted, the laughter had faded, and what had once been a showcase of luxury now felt like a stage for a reckoning. Samuel was no longer just an investor in the restaurant. The moment he had entered, it was clear to everyone that his position was one of silent, unseen power, one that commanded respect simply by existing in the space. But this wasn't just about a table. This was about something deeper. A few moments after they had settled in, the rest of the evening's indulgences fell away, replaced by a sense of inevitable change. Samuel had made his declaration, and in the silence that followed, the deeper truth was exposed. The biases, the silent discrimination, and the judgments based on appearance were not just flaws in the system, they were embedded in its very core. Alicia had never needed the spotlight, but as she looked around the room at the guests who had once ignored her, she realized that what had happened here was far bigger than an individual slight. It was the embodiment of an entire system that needed to be torn down and rebuilt. The problem wasn't the one table, but the whole structure that had made it possible for her to be erased in the first place. The next chapter of this evening, however, would unfold in a far more serious setting. As the night carried on and the murmurs in the restaurant began to subside, Samuel knew the battle wasn't over. He had made his point, but he wasn't just going to sit back and let it pass. This was bigger than just a confrontation with a manager and a hostess who were caught in the web of systemic bias. This was a chance for a real transformation, a chance to expose the rot in the system, not just in Vivre Blanc, but in every luxury establishment that quietly maintained such a culture of exclusion. Samuel called for an emergency board meeting with the PlayStation leadership of Vivre Blanc, the same executives who ran the operation behind the scenes, and a very different kind of conversation was about to unfold. By 7:30 p.m., the board members began to trickle into a private conference room where the tension was palpable. Even before Samuel had spoken a word, the room was cold, sterile. In its elegance, a space designed to hold the weight of corporate decisions, not emotional confrontations. As the doors closed, the energy shifted. It was clear that this wasn't a typical business discussion. The stakes were higher than mere profit margins or market share. This was about morality, respect, and justice, and the board members who had once held unchallenged authority were now on the defensive. Samuel sat at the head of the table, his posture calm but commanding. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence was enough to fill the room. Alicia wasn't present. This battle had already been fought and won in the restaurant. Tonight it was Samuel's war to finish. As the executives took their seats, fidgeting nervously, it became clear that Samuel had already prepared for this moment. He wasn't just taking a stand against the actions of the staff. That evening, he was preparing to dismantle the power structure that had made such action possible. The meeting began with Samuel's cold statement. "I've called this emergency session under Clause 12 of the Operating Charter gross misconduct, requiring executive review," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that forced the board members to pay attention. A few glanced at each other nervously, unsure of what was coming. One of the older board members, a man with silver hair, leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Samuel, I understand. The situation was unfortunate," he said, trying to play the role of the peacemaker. "But are we certain this warrants such an escalated response?" Gareth Simmons has been with us since the beginning. He helped build the Vivre Blanc experience. Samuel tilted his head slightly, the faintest of smiles pulling at the corner of his lips. "What exactly is the Vivre Blanc experience?" he asked, his voice quiet but cutting. The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. The room went still, the executives shifting in their chairs, uncomfortably. "Is it about ambiance and foie gras?" Samuel continued. "Or is it about creating a space where only a certain type of person is allowed in? A space where bias is the currency and dignity is bought and sold?" His words, measured yet precise, landed with a thud. The room seemed to breathe in collectively, the unspoken acknowledgement of the truth hanging between them. No one spoke. A younger board member cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "We've seen the reservation logs," he said, trying to maintain control of the situation. "The override is clear, but how can we prove intent?" "Intent?" Samuel asked, his voice now taking on a sharp edge. "Intent isn't always written down. Sometimes it's in the pattern. I don't need to prove intent. What I'm showing you is the systemic bias that has been allowed to persist here. Over the past 6 months, 17 instances of minority guests being moved or misplaced. 12 of those instances involved their reserved tables being reassigned to white guests who had not made reservations. And in every one of those cases, Gareth had override access. Samuel clicked a button on his tablet, and a screen lit up behind him. A color-coded spreadsheet appeared, time-stamped and damning. The data was irrefutable. "This isn't just a few isolated incidents," he continued, his voice growing more intense. "This is a culture of discrimination that you've fostered, and it's costing you more than just your reputation. It's costing you guests, and it's costing you loyalty." Gareth, who had been standing quietly by the door, shifted uncomfortably. His face was pale, but he tried to maintain composure. "I didn't realize," he began. But Samuel cut him off. "You didn't realize. But you knew," he said, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. "You knew exactly what you were doing. This isn't just a mistake. It's a pattern. And you, Gareth, are the one responsible for allowing it to continue." The room was silent. The other board members avoided eye contact, unwilling to speak up in defense of Gareth. Samuel's gaze was unwavering as he continued. "This isn't just about one guest. This is about the system you've created here. And it's broken." By the time Samuel finished speaking, it was clear. Gareth Simmons was done. His tenure with the company was over. The decision was made in that moment, but the fallout would ripple through the entire luxury industry, exposing the biases that had long been concealed behind polished facades and curated luxury. The meeting, which had been intended to handle a few technical missteps, had now become a turning point. This was not just about correcting one incident. It was about remaking an entire system. And as the board members reluctantly nodded, Samuel knew that his fight for change had only just begun. The aftermath of the events at Vivre Blanc rippled through the luxury dining world, sending shockwaves that no one could ignore. What had started as a singular act of discrimination against Alicia Munro had become a full-fledged reckoning that would change the face of the industry. The moment Samuel Munro had called out the systemic biases at the restaurant, the truth began to spread first within the walls of Vivre Blanc, and then across the broader world of upscale establishments. Media outlets picked up the story, and within hours, it had gone viral. Headlines blasted across social media and news platforms, revealing the hidden undercurrent of discrimination that had plagued luxury restaurants and hotels for decades. Alicia Munro, who had been humiliated only hours earlier, had now become a symbol of resistance and empowerment. No longer just a professor or a scholar, she was now the voice of the voiceless, the one who had stood up when no one else dared to. As stories about her confrontation at Vivre Blanc spread, she was invited to speak at conferences and panels. However, Alicia chose a different path. Instead of speaking at events where her narrative might be diluted or sensationalized, she wrote an academic paper titled Table 3, Silent, Discrimination, and the Map of Disrespect. The paper, filled with sharp insights and backed by data, became an immediate success. It was more than just an academic analysis. It was a call to action. In it, Alicia dissected the quiet, invisible forms of discrimination that permeated elite circles, places like Vivre Blanc, where appearance and wealth were valued more than dignity and humanity. The paper soon became required reading in academic institutions and think tanks, sparking a broader conversation about power, race, and exclusion. In the corporate world, the media buzz was relentless, and it was clear that Alicia's impact was far-reaching. Luxury brands and upscale restaurants, including some of Vivre Blanc's competitors, found themselves thrust into the spotlight. Many of them were named in the ongoing conversations about systemic bias, and they too were forced to confront their practices. The pressure to change became undeniable. Some tried to deflect the accusations, but the stories from employees, customers, and even former patrons began to surface. It wasn't just Vivre Blanc that had to face its shortcomings. It was an entire industry that had to reckon with the inconvenient truths it had long ignored. The luxury hospitality world could no longer hide. behind its polished walls, its pristine marble floors, and its curated atmosphere. The public, once dazzled by the glitter of exclusivity, was now demanding accountability. The once untouchable establishment of Vivre Blanc now found itself the subject of widespread scrutiny. But the change did not stop there. Inside Vivre Blanc, Samuel and Alicia Monroe spearheaded a complete overhaul. The restaurant, once known for its prestige and impenetrable walls of exclusivity, began its transformation. The old systems, built on silent biases and invisible barriers, were dismantled. Vivre Blanc introduced a new policy, one that addressed not only the systemic issues but also the very foundation of how they did business. A new reservation system was implemented, one that used AI to monitor for biases, ensuring that all guests, regardless of their race, gender, or social status, had equal access to the restaurant's most coveted tables. No longer would reservations be accidentally misplaced or reassigned based on someone's appearance. The changes were not just in technology, they were in the very culture of the restaurant. Staff training programs were revamped, focusing on inclusivity, cultural competency, and, most importantly, empathy. This wasn't just about preventing further incidents. It was about creating a space where everyone could feel seen and valued. The shift at Vivre Blanc became a model for other high-end establishments that had been operating with similar unspoken rules. A few of the restaurant's competitors, once hesitant to address their own internal practices, now began following Vivre Blanc's lead. Many started to implement reservation logs with transparency, training their staff to actively engage with the guests from all walks of life. Some even publicly apologized for past failures, while others followed Alicia's lead and started working with organizations dedicated to social equity in the luxury industry. Vivre Blanc, under the leadership of Samuel and Alicia, had set a new standard, one that acknowledged its past wrongs while working toward a more inclusive future. The change was not instantaneous, and there was resistance, especially from some members of the old guard. Some critics argued that Vivre Blanc had caved to social pressures and lost the essence of what made the restaurant special. But as time went on, it became clear that the restaurant had not only maintained its elegance and prestige, it had enhanced it. The guests who arrived now did so with an understanding that they were part of a new era, one where luxury was no longer defined by exclusivity, but by inclusivity and authenticity. The reputation of Vivre Blanc had grown stronger, and its reputation for integrity had become just as valuable as its reputation for fine dining. The impact of the changes at Vivre Blanc reached beyond the restaurant itself. Social media, influencers, bloggers, and journalists began to write about their experiences dining at the Fourme restaurant post-transformation. Many praised the new atmosphere, citing that it felt more welcoming and more inclusive. The number of new patrons, including those from diverse backgrounds, skyrocketed. It was clear that a shift had occurred, not just in Vivre Blanc, but in the entire hospitality industry. Alicia and Samuel's fight for justice had sparked something bigger, a movement toward reparative justice and inclusivity within industries long dominated by the elite. As the weeks and months passed, the restaurant's changes became a benchmark for others. In the luxury sector, diversity panels were introduced, and employee feedback systems were established to give staff a voice in shaping the restaurant's future. Alicia's work was cited frequently, and her influence grew. Her academic paper, Table 3, was shared by countless individuals across various sectors, from education to corporate governance. More importantly, the corporate world began to realize that respect, integrity, and equality were not just ethical choices, they were business imperatives. Alicia and Samuel had not just exposed a broken system, they had shown the world how to rebuild it. In the end, the changes at Vivre Blanc while sparked by one woman's quiet dignity in the face of discrimination, had far-reaching consequences. It wasn't just about the restaurant, it was about an industry awakening to the fact that no one, no matter their background or appearance, should ever be made to feel invisible. Alicia Monroe had not only reclaimed her seat at the table, she had redefined the rules of the game. Vivre Blanc didn't reopen with a press conference, a celebrity chef, or a flashy Instagram campaign. It reopened with quiet conviction. After weeks of intense media scrutiny and an internal revolution led by Samuel and Alicia Monroe, the restaurant that once embodied silent elitism was reborn, not through words, but through action. The once exclusionary atmosphere was replaced by an air of intentional welcome, a place where elegance no longer depended on designer heels or last names, but on dignity, mutual respect, and conscious presence. At the heart of this transformation was Alicia Monroe, not as a protester, not as a victim, but as a visionary. Her quiet resistance had cracked the marble facade of a centuries-old system, and in its place, she and Samuel built something entirely new. The restaurant's layout was subtly adjusted, not through expensive renovations, but by rethinking space. No more undesirable tables by the kitchen or in dim corners. Each seating area was now designed for visibility, inclusion, and experience, not hierarchy. The table that once caused an uproar, Table 3, was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was now permanently listed on the reservation map as Dr. Monroe's table, not as a symbol of ownership, but of legacy. Behind the scenes, the change was even more profound. A new digital reservation system was implemented, synced with cloud-based archives, and encrypted to prevent manipulation. Every seating change was now time-stamped and tracked, ensuring transparency at every level. No more could a guest's name be erased based on unconscious bias or quiet prejudice. The system had been redesigned to remember names, to ensure that people were not only counted but respected. Equity, as Alicia once said, is not a performance. It's a practice. The staff, too, had been transformed. Gone were the days of silent complicity and rehearsed smiles for the right kind of guests. Now, every employee, from hosts to servers to kitchen staff, underwent bias training, leadership workshops, and inclusion seminars. But more importantly, they were given a voice. Weekly dialogues were introduced, where employees could share experiences, raise concerns, and propose ideas. It was no longer just Samuel's restaurant. It was theirs too. Isaiah, the once overlooked server who had timidly asked during the crisis, "Are we safe?" speaking up now, was now the director of guest experience. He wore his title proudly, his blazer embroidered not with gold trim, but with words that captured the restaurant's new ethos. Equity is the new luxury. He no longer moved through the restaurant silently. Now, he greeted guests by name, trained new staff with purpose, and helped build a culture that wasn't based on fear, but on trust. Perhaps most powerfully, the menu itself had been rewritten. Not just the dishes, but the story behind them. Each course now included acknowledgments of the cultures and communities whose cuisines had been co-opted or forgotten. This dish is inspired by African culinary traditions that shaped Southern cuisine. This flavor profile honors Vietnamese street food, often imitated, rarely credited. The menu became a narrative, and eating at Vivre Blanc was no longer just a luxury. It was a journey of recognition. And then came the wall. Once adorned with portraits of French vineyards and European estates, it had been replaced with something new. At its center hung a black and white photograph of a woman seated in profile, chin lifted toward soft window light, posture elegant and unyielding. Below it, a bronze plaque read, "Table 3, where elegance rewrote the rules." Guests paused before it, whispered about it, asked staff who the woman was. And the staff never answered directly. They didn't have to. The room already knew. The return of Alicia and Samuel Monroe to Vivre Blanc weeks later was not a triumphant march, but a quiet reclaiming. Alicia wore a flowing ivory dress, no labels, no designer, jewelry, her curls cascading softly over her shoulders. As she walked in beside Samuel, no one stopped them. No one questioned her presence. Conversations softened. The staff straightened. Respect, this time, was not a performance. It was instinctive. Isaiah greeted them at the door with a firm, genuine smile. Dr. Monroe. Mr. Monroe, welcome back. Your table is ready. When they sat at table 3, there were no grand gestures, no applause. Just recognition. As the server placed the menu down, she whispered, "Tonight's menu is inspired by women who lead without needing to raise their voices." Alicia smiled, not out of pride, but out of understanding. The message was clear. She had not just changed a restaurant. She had changed a mindset. By the end of the evening, Isaiah returned not with dessert, but with a small black envelope. Inside was the original reservation, confirmation time-stamped, framed behind glass, proof of the erasure, and now, proof of its undoing. Alicia held it for a long moment, then said, softly, "Sometimes history needs a receipt." Samuel raised his glass. Not just for this table, but for everyone who's ever been told they didn't belong. Outside, the city pulsed on cars, conversations, the low hum of movement. But inside Vivre Blanc, something had shifted permanently. The energy was different. And it wasn't just this. Restaurant. News of Vivre Blanc's transformation had inspired ripple effects across the industry. In Seattle, a luxury spa began revising its intake forms. In New York, a hotel chain quietly installed bias detection software. In Atlanta, a jazz lounge changed its dress code. Policy, after a viral clip from Alicia's story, called out its discrimination against natural hair. No press releases, just change. Alicia never sought fame. She never wanted to become a symbol. But when the university renamed her guest lecture series, "The Geography of Power," whose table is it anyway? And attendance tripled. She realized the impact. Her closing words said it all. The problem was never the seat. The problem was who believed they had the right to decide who could sit in it. Standards aren't eternal. They're chosen. And it's time we choose better ones. That's exactly what Vivre Blanc had done. And it had changed everything. In the heart of the luxurious Vivre Blanc restaurant, a quiet battle for dignity unfolded. Alicia Monroe, a respected professor, found herself humiliated and denied the seat her husband had, reserved simply because of her appearance. The staff, caught in the silent web of systemic bias, tried to dismiss her presence, but Alicia refused to stay silent. As the tension reached its peak, her husband, Samuel Monroe, arrived, a silent investor with a powerful presence. The room shifted. With calm authority, he exposed the invisible rules that had governed the space, revealing that Alicia wasn't just his wife, but a woman of undeniable worth. The battle was no longer just about reclaiming a table. It was about standing up to the quiet prejudices that sought to erase her. In that moment, Samuel made a bold statement. True power lies not in dominance, but in recognition of one's worth. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about belonging. And as the staff and guests realized their mistake, the Monroes reclaimed their space, not with anger, but with quiet strength and dignity. Life will often present us with moments where we're overlooked, dismissed, or treated as if we don't belong. But remember this: true strength comes from standing firm in who you are, and never allowing others to define your worth. The quiet power of self-respect can change the entire room. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment where you stood up for yourself? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more stories that will inspire you to live with purpose and dignity.